So imagine for a second that you are looking at a live data feed of a national energy grid, a massive one, right? It's like serving over 1 billion people.
Yeah, true. A massive scale.
Right. And it's the middle of the day, the sun is beating down, and you check the numbers. Right there on the screen, you see that a staggering 50% of the peak energy capacity is being delivered by solar power.
I mean, that is the exact scenario policymakers have been chasing for decades, you know? It's the absolute pinnacle of the green energy transition, just realized in real time on a national scale.
Exactly. You look at that 50% and you think, wow, the green utopia is finally here. The panels are absorbing photons, the inverters are syncing up with the grid, we are decarbonizing the economy, and supposedly achieving energy independence.
Supposedly being the key word there.
Yeah, because then, well, the Earth rotates,
Yeah.
night falls. The solar generation curve just flatlines. You check that exact same data feed, and that beautiful 50% number plummets down to just 20%.
Yeah.
And suddenly the whole thing is being carried only by wind, hydro, and baseline fossil fuels.
Which is pretty jarring. That drop is where the idealism of the energy transition just violently collides with the physical reality of grid management.
It really is.
It completely shatters the illusion that a massive modern economy can run purely on, good intentions and sunshine without an incredibly complex and honestly heavily contested geopolitical foundation underneath it all.
Right. Well, welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to explore a truly fascinating transcript from a panel hosted by the Observer Research Foundation. The panel is titled How India Spent 40 Years Building a Self-Reliant Nuclear Power Under Sanctions. But, the conversation goes way beyond just nuclear energy.
Oh, absolutely. It covers so much ground.
We are going to unpack how a rapidly growing nation navigates the really treacherous waters of the global energy transition, domestic manufacturing, and shifting geopolitical dependencies.
And the source material we are working with here, it provides a really rare look under the hood of global statecraft. It features high-level experts. We're talking policymakers, think tank leaders, former government officials.
The people actually in the room.
Exactly. And they are discussing the messy reality of trying to secure a nation's energy future when the rules of the global order are just being rewritten in real time.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really get into the mindset of these panelists, I want you, the listener, to think about something incredibly mundane. Just think about what happens when you walk into a room and flip a light switch.
It just comes on.
Right, the light comes on instantly. But to guarantee that split-second illumination, there is this massive hidden architecture of international borders, diplomatic crises, and decades of policy warfare.
Because we only ever interact with, the final millimeter of that supply chain. We see the light, but we don't see the ships navigating contested straits. We don't see the boardroom negotiations over critical mineral rights.
Or the National Security Councils, right?
Yeah, the Security Council's running actual war games to figure out how to keep that exact light switch functioning 10 years from now, especially if a global conflict erupts.
And to understand the sheer scale of the panic happening behind closed doors regarding that supply chain, we first have to look at the fragile nature of the current green revolution. We have to go back to that terrifying drop from 50% to 20% capacity when the sun goes down.
Yeah, that statistic, which was actually mentioned as a tweet one of the panelists read on the morning of the event, it perfectly frames the immediate problem.
It really does.
Achieving 50% peak capacity from solar is a monumental engineering feat for a country of India's size. But that nighttime drop, it exposes the fundamental vulnerability of intermittent renewables, the desperate need for utility-scale energy storage.
Because, you can't just mandate that 1.4 billion people only use their hospitals or run their data centers or operate their heavy industry when the sun is shining.
Right, the economy doesn't sleep.
No, it doesn't. So the moment you introduce solar at that scale, you inherently introduce the need for massive battery banks, smart grid components, and specialized storage solutions to capture, hold, and actually distribute that power after sunset.
And that technological requirement is exactly what creates the geopolitical trap. To build out that solar infrastructure, to manufacture the panels, the grid-forming inverters, the battery storage, the panel noted a staggering reality. India currently relies on imports for roughly 90% of its solar components.
90%.
Yeah.
That isn't a supply chain, that's a lifeline you just do not control.
And it gets even more complicated when you look at the mechanics of that supply chain. The primary source for these components, the refined polysilicon, the solar wafers, the critical minerals driving this transition, is China.
A nation that happens to be India's most significant strategic rival.
Exactly.
So let's examine how that happened, because countries don't just accidentally hand over 90% of their energy infrastructure market.
No, they definitely don't. The mechanism here is a decades-long industrial strategy. Chinese manufacturers, heavily backed by state subsidies and highly integrated supply chains, achieved such massive economies of scale that they just drove the global price of solar modules into the floor. Yeah, so for a developing nation trying to electrify cheaply, buying imported panels was just the only economically viable option for years. But the hidden cost of that cheap energy is absolute dependency.
See, it just seems like a massive strategic miscalculation.
Yeah.
It's like deciding you want to be financially independent, so you cut up all your credit cards to escape the big banks. But then to pay your rent, you take out a massive loan from your biggest, most aggressive business rival.
Yeah.
You haven't achieved independence. You've just transferred your debt to a much more dangerous creditor.
What's fascinating here is that the panelists in the source material use almost that exact framing.
Really?
Yeah, one of them explicitly points out the profound irony of the global energy transition. Nations are proudly pivoting away from fossil fuels to escape the volatility of traditional energy markets, only to land straight into a brand new dependency that operates with even tighter bottlenecks.
I mean, the old dependencies were clear,
Yeah.
right? The transcript mentions the quote-unquote good old royalties and monarchies of the Gulf.
Yeah.
The geopolitics of oil have driven global policy for a century. We understand how OPEC works. We understand the shipping routes.
But the new reality, as starkly framed by a former national security official on the panel, is that you are trading those Gulf monarchies for the hands of, and this is a direct quote from the source, the communists in Beijing.
Right, and we should pause here just to make our position super clear to the listener. We are not endorsing a specific ideological stance on these foreign governments. We are impartially reporting the strategic calculus of the Indian panelists in the source text.
Absolutely.
So from their viewpoint, the government in Beijing is a strategic rival, and relying on them for 90% of the energy transition's hardware is an unacceptable national vulnerability.
Yeah, we have to view this through the lens of the people whose actual job is national defense.
Yeah.
From their perspective, the anxiety is completely justified. If you are 90% dependent on a single rival nation, they control the levers of your future economy.
They decide the export quotas on refined lithium.
Yes, they determine the allocation of solar wafers. They effectively hold veto power over your domestic growth for the next decade.
And this economic dependency exists simultaneously with active military friction. The panelists describe this as a really peculiar situation, noting that you have military forces in tense standoffs along the Himalayan border, while your trade ministries are heavily reliant on that exact same nation to keep your energy transition alive.
It's an untenable contradiction. You are trying to build a sovereign energy system, but the keys are held by the nation you are actively guarding your borders against.
Pretty wild.
This terrifying realization that energy could no longer be treated merely as a commodity traded on the open market, it forces a massive shift in government strategy. It elevates energy from an economic issue to a matter of hard national defense.
Which brings us to a specific historical pivot discussed at length in the source material, the year 2020.
Right.
I mean, 2020 was a global catalyst for a lot of things, primarily due to the pandemic. But the panel isolates it as the specific watershed moment for Indian energy policy.
Yeah. According to the transcript, 2020 was the year the concept of energy as a hard national security priority truly took root in the Indian government. The pandemic shattered the illusion of the just-in-time global economy. Supply chains just seized up overnight.
But it wasn't just COVID, right?
No, not at all. You had geopolitical disruptions stemming from Iran, early warning signs of volatility in Eastern Europe that would eventually lead to the Ukraine conflict, and, critically for India, severe border clashes.
So all these external shocks just hit the system at once. The national security apparatus looks at this and realizes they can no longer leave the country's energy future in the hands of the free market.
Exactly. So around 2020, the National Security Council essentially forced its way into the energy and technology planning space. They initiated massive structural interventions.
Yeah.
This is when the push for a domestic semiconductor mission really gained traction, and when the intense focus on securing critical minerals and rare earths was framed as a defense imperative rather than just, an industrial goal.
But government bureaucracies are notoriously territorial. The people already running the energy and economic sectors didn't just step aside, did they? I mean, the transcript describes some significant internal friction.
Oh, it was a profound bureaucratic turf war. The line ministries, the departments traditionally responsible for energy, trade, and economic growth, they fiercely opposed this intrusion by the security apparatus.
The source mentions Amitabh Kant in this context, and we should clarify for the listener. Amitabh Kant was the CEO of Niti Aayog at the time, which is the apex public policy think tank of the Indian government. They are the chief economic planners.
Yes, and Aayog replaced the old Planning Commission, and Kant is a figure practically synonymous with India's aggressive push for electric vehicles and modern industrialization. The transcript notes that figures like Kant essentially told the national security apparatus to stay in their lane.
Just back off.
Yeah. The argument was you handle the military, border defense, and intelligence. You know nothing about the economics of clean energy or the complexities of global supply chains. Stay out of our domain.
On the surface, it sounds like standard bureaucratic infighting.
Hmm.
But if we look at the mechanics of how these two groups operate, they are fundamentally at odds. The economic planners are operating on immediate timelines. They are looking at the spot market for energy.
Right.
Their mandate is to provide the cheapest possible electricity to 1.4 billion people today.
Because their primary accountability is to the current democratic mandate. If energy prices spike uncontrollably, or if the grid fails because they refuse to buy cheap imported solar panels, the economic planners are the ones who face the immediate fallout.
So they have to optimize for cost and speed.
Exactly. They are incentivized to optimize for cost and speed above all else.
But the National Security Council isn't looking at this quarter's energy prices.
No, the national security planners are operating on a 10 to 15-year horizon. They are modeling threats that haven't even materialized yet. They don't care if a domestic solar wafer costs 20% more than an imported one today. They care about whether a foreign power could embargo those wafers a decade from now, effectively shutting down the Indian economy.
So you have the people tasked with keeping the lights on today, locked in a battle with the people tasked with ensuring the nation's survival in 15 years. How does a government even reconcile that?
Well, the source notes that over the last 6 years, a quiet revolution has occurred. The panelist, who was on the national security side of that turf war, admitted that today, the economic planners and the security planners are completely aligned.
Wow, a complete 180.
Yeah. The realization that clean energy is a national security priority has finally bridged that gap.
But during that messy transition period in 2020, the transcript mentions a very specific buzzword that became the cornerstone of policy: trusted supply chains. Everyone was suddenly talking about building trusted supply chains.
Yeah, that was everywhere.
And I have to challenge that concept. Is trust a viable economic mechanism, or is it just a diplomatic band-aid used until a country can build its own factories?
This raises an important question, and the panel dissects it pretty thoroughly. The consensus is that trust is really just a transitional mechanism. The source outlines a clear evolution in policy language. In 2020, amidst the panic, the slogan was "trusted partners." Today, the dominant strategic flavor is domestic manufacturing and domestic industrialization.
So the ultimate goal is autarky, like complete national self-sufficiency.
They are realistic enough to know that 100% self-sufficiency is impossible for an economy of that scale. The panel argues that foreign, trusted supply chains should be treated as a bridging arrangement.
Got it.
You use those trusted partners to service your immediate requirements, keeping the grid running and the transition moving, while deploying heavy state intervention to build domestic resilience.
But if building these domestic factories and secure supply chains takes 10 to 15 years, which the panel stresses repeatedly, we hit a massive chronological problem. What keeps the economy running in the interim? And the answer, according to the transcript, isn't high-tech or green at all. It lies buried in the ground.
Which brings us to the stubborn, unglamorous, and absolutely vital role of coal.
Right. We hear constantly about glossy, high-tech energy targets.
Yeah.
The panel mentions the government's highly publicized goal of reaching 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030. But despite all that declaratory policy, the source material explicitly states that fossil fuels are back in fashion.
It is a profound reality check. For all the global rhetoric about decarbonization, the transcript plainly states that when supply chains got tight, India went right back to coal and oil. Currently, coal still makes up a massive 55% of India's energy mix.
55%, in the middle of a highly publicized green transition.
Yeah.
But the panelist makes a critical point about the mechanism of coal. It isn't just about cheap energy. It provides a very specific type of energy sovereignty.
Yes. Consider the worst-case scenario modeled by the national security planners. If the disruptions in the Middle East escalate, or if global shipping lanes in the South China Sea are blockaded, severing the supply of imported liquefied natural gas and solar
Which
components.
is a real possibility.
Right. The panelist notes that the only reliable safeguard for hundreds of millions of people, particularly outside the major metropolises, is domestic coal and biogas.
And because the mechanism of delivery doesn't rely on international goodwill.
Hmm.
You don't have to navigate a contested ocean or negotiate with a rival for a microchip to make coal burn. It is physically present within your borders. You extract it and you utilize it.
And physical possession is paramount when you examine India's broader vulnerabilities. The source points out a staggering historical constant. India currently imports roughly 88% of its oil and gas requirements.
Oh, wow.
And that percentage has not dropped a single point in 50 years.
Let's just let that sink in.
Yeah.
Half a century of technological advancement, massive economic reforms, multiple global energy crises, and they are still importing 88% of their hydrocarbons. Why hasn't that moved?
It's a combination of geological constraints and exponential consumption growth. Domestic exploration and production simply haven't yielded reserves massive enough to offset the demands of an economy growing at 6 to 8% annually.
Right.
As one panelist noted, nearly every dollar earned by exporting services to the United States or Europe is almost immediately redirected to purchase oil from someone else just to keep the machine running.
Which totally explains the intensity of the internal debate. The transcript highlights a literal factional split within the government between the quote-unquote coal guys and the non-coal guys.
And the coal guys view the renewables guys with deep skepticism. They look at the 90% dependency on China for solar components and say, India has some of the largest coal reserves in the world. Why would we intentionally trade a resource we physically control for an infrastructure entirely dependent on a geopolitical rival?
That's the renewables faction has a counter-argument, right?
Yeah.
Because they point out that India actually imports a massive amount of coal as well. It isn't entirely a domestic supply.
This is where the geopolitical nuance is critical. The expert on the panel explains that while India does import a significant portion of its coal, primarily to meet the specific calorific requirements of certain power plants or steel mills, the nature of that dependency is fundamentally different.
How so? I mean, an import is an import, isn't it?
Not geopolitically. India imports coal from Indonesia, Australia, or South Africa do not have active border disputes with India.
Right.
They do not view India as a primary strategic rival, and they operate in a highly diversified, competitive global market. They do not possess the monopolistic chokehold over the supply chain that the primary supplier of renewable components does.
So what does this all mean for India's diplomatic posture? If they are quietly acknowledging that coal is their only true safety net for the next 15 years, how do they navigate international climate summits, where the primary goal is to eradicate coal?
Well, it means they are fundamentally altering their narrative. The source notes a highly illustrative diplomatic maneuver. India recently refused to host COP33, the United Nations Climate Change Conference.
Refusing to host COP is a massive signal. It's essentially stepping away from the microphone of global climate diplomacy.
The panelist explains the logic behind this shift. Historically, India's argument at these summits was rooted in climate justice. Quote, "We deserve carbon space because our per capita emissions are incredibly low and the developed world caused the historical problem."
The classic equity argument.
Right. But as India's gross emissions rise alongside its booming economy, that argument has lost its diplomatic utility.
So they are transitioning from playing the climate victim to asserting pragmatic leadership. They are balancing their massive green energy ambitions with the unforgiving reality of their coal dependency. They are refusing to be boxed into international commitments that compromise their short-term economic survival.
And while the government is locked in this intense debate weighing the geopolitical risks of Chinese solar against the environmental stigma of domestic coal, the source material points out an almost absurd contradiction in their long-term planning.
This was easily the most fascinating revelation in the entire transcript, because while everyone is arguing about how to build a green supply chain from scratch, India already solved a massive energy independence problem over the last 40 years, and policymakers are somehow just ignoring it.
Yeah, the transcript captures a moment of deep frustration from one of the think tank panelists. She points out that India has spent the last 4 decades building an entirely complete, robust, and sovereign supply chain for nuclear energy, and they do it under the crushing weight of international sanctions.
We need to explain the mechanics of this because it is an incredible feat of engineering and statecraft. How do you build a nuclear industry when the entire world cuts you off?
It goes back to 1974, following India's first nuclear test. In response, the global community formed the Nuclear Suppliers Group, effectively embargoing India from accessing nuclear technology equipment or enriched uranium.
Wow.
Cut off from the global market, Indian scientists had to engineer their own pathway.
Because they couldn't import enriched uranium, they had to design reactors that could run on the natural, unenriched uranium they could mine domestically.
Exactly. They perfected the pressurized heavy water reactor, or PHWR. They developed the metallurgy, the heavy water production facilities, the control systems, and the entirely domestic supply chain required to build and operate these plants safely.
That's amazing.
They essentially forged a sovereign energy ecosystem in total isolation.
So they have the proven reactors, they have the domestic knowledge base, they have the supply chain. I mean, this is exactly the kind of energy sovereignty the National Security Council is begging for in the solar sector. So why aren't they just mass producing these heavy water reactors right now?
According to the frustrated panelist, policymakers have fallen victim to the allure of novel technology. Instead of scaling up their proven indigenous PHWRs, the government is currently doing cartwheels over unproven concepts like small modular reactors or SMRs.
Let's break down why that is so frustrating to the experts. What is the theoretical appeal of an SMR, and why is it a distraction here?
Theoretically, SMRs are designed to be manufactured in a central factory and shipped to a site for assembly. It's much like building a laptop versus constructing a massive mainframe computer from scratch in a server room. Proponents argue they will be cheaper and faster to deploy.
All right, that sounds great in theory.
But the reality is that the global SMR supply chain barely exists. It is largely a technology on paper or in early prototype phases.
It's an infatuation with the next big thing. It's like spending years perfecting a gourmet recipe in your own kitchen, but instead of making it, you order expensive experimental takeout every night. They are looking at the theoretical efficiency of these laptops and completely ignoring the fact that they spent 40 years building a world-class, fully functional mainframe infrastructure that is ready to be deployed at scale right now.
The panelist describes this as a massive gap between declaratory policy and implementation. The government proudly announces nuclear targets, but the existing proven assets are inexplicably shackled.
Which is so strange.
Yeah, they are prevented from entering mission mode to produce at the massive scale they are capable of, while capital and political attention are diverted to shiny imported concepts.
She calls it her cry in the wilderness. It's a plea to recognize that the solution to energy sovereignty is already sitting in their backyard. But the transcript does note some recent positive movement, doesn't it?
Yes, the alignment of the national security apparatus with the energy sector has finally spurred some legislative action. The government has made significant amendments to the Indian Atomic Energy Act, and they are beginning the complex process of privatizing aspects of the nuclear sector.
What does privatization look like in a sector historically dominated by state secrecy?
It doesn't mean private companies will own the nuclear material, but it opens the door for private capital to fund the construction and operation of the plants through EPC engineering, procurement, and construction contracts. It is a massive step toward injecting the capital needed for scale.
However, the panel repeatedly emphasizes the unforgiving chronologies of energy infrastructure. Even if they stop chasing SMRs today and fully commit private capital to building indigenous reactors, what is the timeline?
It takes a minimum of 8 to 10 years to build a nuclear plant, from site selection and pouring the concrete to connecting it to the grid.
So even with perfect execution starting tomorrow, those massive megawatts won't hit the grid until the late 2030s. Which brings us to the core tension of the entire transition. You have 1.4 billion people whose energy demands are growing exponentially today.
Right.
But building the domestic factories to supply green energy or the nuclear plants to provide baseload takes a decade.
Right.
How do you balance the need for speedy deployment with the necessity of domestic capability?
It is the classic debate, Do we deploy foreign technology rapidly to save the environment and power the economy, or do we deploy slowly to ensure we build the domestic supply chains? One of the panelists, an American expert in national security and energy, offers a pretty counterintuitive answer. You don't choose between them.
That sounds like a contradiction. How can you have rapid deployment if you are waiting for domestic factories to be built?
Her logic is grounded in the mechanics of industrial scaling. She argues that the massive scale of India's domestic market The sheer, terrifying volume of energy deployment required is not a burden. It is actually a wonderful gift if leveraged correctly.
How does needing an overwhelming amount of energy translate into a gift for domestic manufacturing?
Because scale creates guaranteed demand. Capital will not flow into building a multi-billion-dollar domestic solar wafer factory unless there is absolute certainty that someone will buy the output.
Oh, okay.
By mandating a massive, rapid build-out of renewable capacity, the government is effectively creating a guaranteed market. The aggressive deployment speed is the very precondition required to attract the capital for domestic capacity building.
But if you just let the market run at top speed, developers will just buy the cheapest components, which brings us right back to the 90% Chinese imports. How do they interrupt that cycle without stalling the deployment?
This is where surgical policy intervention is required. The expert notes that you don't need 100% of the market serviced by domestic manufacturing immediately.
Right.
The government uses mechanisms like the approved list of models and manufacturers. It's essentially a whitelist. If a developer wants to bid on government-backed solar projects, they must use components from this list, which prioritizes domestic manufacturers.
Ah, so it's a non-tariff barrier. It allows the government to shield the nascent domestic industry, giving them a protected segment of the market to learn, scale, and drive down costs, while still allowing some imported technology for private, hyperspeed deployment.
Exactly. And the data suggests this highly managed approach is yielding results. The transcript highlights projections that are radically different from the current 90% import dependency. By 2030, India is projected not merely to reduce imports, but to become a net exporter of solar modules, and to export between 20 to 25% of their total solar wafer capacity.
Going from total reliance on a strategic rival to exporting a quarter of your wafer capacity in less than a decade is a monumental industrial pivot. But can state mandates alone drive that kind of efficiency?
The panel argues that state mandates are only part of the equation. To truly scale, you need market forces to take over. To illustrate this, they look back to a historical precedent they call the Jamnagar moment of 1997.
The Jamnagar moment.
Yeah.
We have to explore the mechanics of this because it is the blueprint for what they are trying to achieve today.
In 1997, the Indian government began deregulating the petroleum refining sector, dismantling the old administered pricing mechanism. In response, Reliance Industries, a private conglomerate, made a massive, highly risky market decision. They built the Jamnagar refinery from scratch in Gujarat.
It wasn't just a refinery, though. It eventually scaled to become the largest, most complex single-site refinery complex in the world.
And the critical detail here is that Jamnagar was not built because of a top-down mandate from the National Security Council. It was built by private capital aggressively pursuing a market opportunity. Yet, that purely economic decision inadvertently gifted the Indian state with massive geopolitical leverage decades later.
Because it gave them the physical infrastructure to process complex crude oils that other nations couldn't handle.
Precisely. When global energy markets were violently disrupted recently, India had the refining complexity to purchase heavily discounted Russian crude, which is often heavier and much harder to refine.
Yeah.
They could process it at Jamnagar, stabilize their domestic fuel prices, and even export the refined products back to global markets.
A market-induced miracle that resulted in sovereign resilience.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the panelists are speculating about where the next Jamnagar moment will occur. They believe that if the government sets the right initial conditions, private capital will eventually trigger spontaneous, massive scaling in sectors like solar wafers, bioethanol, or biomass fuels, driven by profit rather than government edicts.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because creating those initial conditions using tariffs and whitelists to block cheaper imports is inherently inflationary. You're forcing developers to buy more expensive domestic panels.
This introduces the concept of the security premium, which is replacing the older concept of the green premium. You are no longer just paying extra for clean energy, you are paying extra for secure, sovereign energy.
And someone has to pay that bill.
Right. And the ongoing debate is about who absorbs that cost. Does the state subsidize it, risking fiscal deficit, or is it passed on to the consumer, risking huge political backlash?
It requires immense capital. And to build out this infrastructure, whether it's domestic solar wafer plants, a fleet of heavy water nuclear reactors, or next-generation biorefineries, India needs to attract global finance. But global finance is currently obsessed with a sector that seems entirely disconnected from the green energy transition.
Which brings us to the final transformative force discussed in the transcript: artificial intelligence.
We generally think of the global energy debate as a zero-sum game between fossil fuels and clean energy, but the transcript reveals a very different reality in the global boardroom. Capital isn't choosing sides.
Capital is funding both, driven by the need for absolute resilience. The panelist observes that major financial institutions and sovereign wealth funds are deploying resources into both legacy and future systems.
So,
Well, for instance, Gulf producers aren't just relying on their oil wells. They are funding massive, forward-deployed strategic stockpiles and alternative pipeline infrastructures, positioning their assets physically closer to the end consumers.
they are bracing the legacy system against shocks, knowing the transition will be chaotic. But simultaneously, the largest tidal wave of capital deployment in human history is flowing into AI. And AI, fundamentally, is an energy problem.
The computational requirements for training and running frontier AI models demand an incomprehensible amount of electricity. Data centers are evolving into massive, power-hungry entities that require uninterrupted, massive baseload power.
Which introduces a logical contradiction that we need to resolve.
Mhm.
We established at the very beginning that solar power drops from 50% to 20% when the sun goes down. AI data centers operate 24/7. They don't sleep. So how can intermittent renewables possibly solve the AI baseload problem?
It's a question of grid integration and substitution. While it is true that solar cannot provide baseload directly at night without massive battery storage, the rapid deployment of solar and utility-scale battery energy storage systems, or BSS, fundamentally alters the entire grid's architecture.
How does that mechanism work?
By deploying massive amounts of cheap solar during the day, a nation can handle the daytime peak load when factories, air conditioners, and data centers are all running simultaneously.
Okay, I follow.
This allows the grid operators to dial back their natural gas or coal turbines during the day, conserving that fuel, and then ramp up those traditional baseload sources at night when the sun sets.
Ah, I see. Solar doesn't power the data center at 2 a.m., but by handling the daytime surge, it frees up the fossil fuels and nuclear plants to guarantee the base load for the data centers overnight.
Exactly. And because solar and battery storage have become relatively inexpensive and incredibly fast to deploy, taking months to build rather than the decade required for a nuclear plant, they are the fastest way to inject overall capacity into a power-starved grid.
That makes total sense.
The insatiable demand from AI is effectively forcing the rapid modernization of the electrical grid, accelerating the deployment of smart infrastructure faster than climate mandates ever could.
AI is acting as the ultimate accelerant for the physical energy transition, not out of environmental altruism, but out of sheer computational hunger.
The panel concludes that the energy ecosystem and the technological innovation ecosystem are no longer separate domains. If a nation wants to secure its energy future, it must be deeply integrated into the innovation supply chains of the future.
And that reality fundamentally rewrites the geopolitical map. If energy security is now inextricably linked to AI, critical minerals, and smart grid components, the diplomatic alliances of the 20th century are obsolete. Your old friends might not be your best friends tomorrow.
The transcript explicitly states that partnerships are in a state of rapid flux. One panelist noted that the nations who will be your closest strategic partners in 10 years might not even feature prominently in your current geopolitical doctrine.
There's an incredible anecdote in the source material that perfectly illustrates how rapidly these global supply chains can be rewired by external shocks. A panelist posed a question. Before the conflict in Ukraine severely disrupted agricultural exports from the Black Sea, who would have thought that every third Indian kitchen would be cooking with sunflower oil, imported all the way from Argentina?
It is a profound example of systemic adaptation. When a crisis severs a traditional supply line, a nation with purchasing power will instantly forge new routes across the globe, turning distant nations into critical suppliers overnight.
So as the energy map is redrawn around critical minerals and AI, who are these emerging partners, the panel laid out several fascinating strategic pivots.
They pointed out that the United States remains an indispensable partner. Despite domestic political fluctuations regarding certain renewable policies like wind power, the U.S. is heavily investing in the foundational elements of the future. Next-generation nuclear technology, securing critical mineral supply chains, and building out resilient grid architectures.
Then you have the advanced economies of Asia.
Yes, the panel specifically highlighted Japan and South Korea. Japan, for instance, has cultivated a highly sophisticated economic security strategy for decades, particularly regarding the sourcing and processing of critical minerals. They have the institutional knowledge and the capital that India desperately needs to replicate.
And finally, a surprising return to the Middle East, but under a completely different paradigm.
Indeed. One panelist noted an emerging doctrine in global energy discussions, the shift from seeking energy sustainability to demanding energy abundance. If the goal is massive, unconstrained energy availability to power an AI-driven economy, then traditional fossil fuel powerhouses like the United Arab Emirates remain critical partners.
Because they have the capital.
Exactly. They are rapidly diversifying their own energy portfolios and deploying capital into global infrastructure.
It is a dizzying, complex matrix of information to process. Let's synthesize the journey we've taken through this Observer Research Foundation transcript.
We began by examining the sheer vulnerability of a modern grid that loses 30% of its capacity at sunset, exposing a terrifying dependency on a single strategic rival for the hardware required to manage that intermittency.
We saw how that vulnerability triggered a bureaucratic turf war, as national security planners forced economic ministries to recognize that the energy transition operates on a 15-year horizon of national survival, not just a quarterly spot market.
We explored the stubborn, pragmatic necessity of coal and domestic hydrocarbons, providing the foundational energy sovereignty that keeps the nation functional while it attempts to construct those green supply chains.
We uncover the irony of the forgotten 40-year nuclear miracle, a fully sovereign indigenous industry built under heavy sanctions, currently sidelined while policymakers chase the theoretical promises of small modular reactors.
We examined the delicate balancing act of scaling up rapidly while aggressively protecting domestic manufacturing, hoping that strategic state mandates will eventually ignite a market-driven Jamnagar moment in green technology.
And finally, we saw how the insatiable power demands of artificial intelligence are rewriting the global boardroom, forcing the integration of energy and innovation, and forging unexpected alliances from Argentina to Japan.
It is an intricate ecosystem where a single policy decision regarding a tariff today will have ripple effects across global supply chains and geopolitical alliances for decades to come.
So, what stands out to you? I want you to really consider the unseen architecture of your daily life. The next time you look at the appliances in your home, or plug in your phone, or rely on a data center to run an application, do you just see a consumer device? Or do you see a vast, invisible web of critical minerals, heavy water reactors, geopolitical turf wars, and national security strategies stretching across the globe?
The panel agreed on one unshakable physical reality. Any significant energy decision made today requires a minimum of 10 to 15 years to materialize in the real world. Yet as artificial intelligence exponentially increases our global power demands in just the next 2 to 3 years, we are entirely reliant on infrastructure and diplomatic strategies that were planned a decade ago. It leaves us with a critical question. Are we currently moving fast enough to physically power the future we are inventing in the digital realm? Or will the technology of tomorrow be severely bottlenecked by the energy diplomacy of yesterday?
Thank you for joining us as we navigated the complexities of this deep dive. We've traversed continents, unraveled bureaucracies, and examined the physical constraints of our technological ambitions because in a world of shifting alliances and fragile supply chains, understanding the mechanisms behind the headlines is the most powerful tool you can possess. The next time you flip that light switch and the darkness instantly disappears, remember that someone, somewhere, spent 10 years fighting to guarantee that exact moment.